So the cosmolocalism, I always say, to distinguish it both from globalism and from localism, it's fully local and it's fully global at the same time.
Hi, my name is Dave, and this is the Light Forest Podcast, a journey of exploration to bring more light into how we live and regenerate our planet. Despair, sadness, anger, disbelief. Some of the emotions that describe our moment. How else to feel in moments of war when daily bombs and missiles are being thrown, families being torn apart, children dying, and an endless war continues, no matter whichever part of the world we look at. Is this what it means to be civilized? Is this our civilization? It's pretty clear that our institutions are fundamentally misaligned with peace or even with life itself. We all live in nation states, built out of a culture of imagination, citizens programmed to dream, dreams competing with other dreams, where one dream is the nightmare of another. Israel, Palestine, China, Taiwan, India, Pakistan. Michel Bauwens, our guest today, says this on nation states and the market. Corporations and states are competitive entities. They are geared towards extraction to serve the relative strength of their owners and citizens. So both these institutions are problematic by themselves in an age facing a planetary meta-crisis. These institutions are problematic, but could it be that the design of the institutions themselves are even why we have this crisis in the first place? In an interconnected living system, where is the external to outsource to? By creating artificial entities that separate and disconnect, that compete against each other to extract finite resources, aren't we creating our very world that we're dealing with today? Aren't the challenges that we face arising from the dynamics of the very institutions that govern our world? And these externalities that we speak of, the commons that we speak of, these commons are us. There is no separation between the fields, between the forests, between the ocean, between our information spaces and our minds and bodies. These externalities of toxins and chemicals we put into our soil make it back into our own bodies through the food we eat and the air that we breathe. And the wars that we fight, the violence that we make, the people that we kill, does it end there? It always comes back. Is our history just not a series of people seeking revenge, one nation from another, a people from another? Constant revenge, constant fighting. There is no other. There is no elsewhere to outsource. And our minds, which we believe separate, are just as affected, and they consume this toxic information that's fed through algorithms as they extract us and create large language models and AI, and we, our minds, become programmed, become weakened, become de-energized, and the commons slowly, step by step, are degraded. So, institutions are really key for regeneration. And in this episode, we're going to look into the roots of our institutions and our civilizations and look for what's possible, what could be an alternative, what could a common centric institution be. Our guest today is someone who spent decades thinking about exactly this question. Michel Bauwens is the founder and director of the P2P Foundation, the leading network dedicated to commons-oriented dynamics in society. When I asked Michel to share his light vision future, he gives us a civilization history perspective on understanding where our civilizations came from, the dynamics of our institutions, and crucially, why he believes we are at a point of transition today, and that transition is where we're really interested in. Michel explains using states and markets. He says that when states and markets are in an ascendancy, they monopolize the commons and through that are able to provide for their people. When they are in ascendancy, they tend to do it well. He says right now we are in a descending phase when states and markets are declining. I think any of us looking around can certainly feel that. In the descending phase, he says, as markets and states start to decline and start to feel the pressure, the common starts to return, which he says is happening now through open source technology, which is allowing non-state and non-market organization. Michel views the current global order as two competing modes. You have the international state sovereign model, which he includes China and India and Russia and some others. And you have the multi-stakeholder managed markets, which are largely the US and Western European. Both of these, he says, are fundamentally extractive in nature. And so we need a third model, a common-centric model to emerge. And this is what a lot of his work focuses on, and this is what the topic of our discussion as well goes into. Michel writes the fourth generation civilization Substack, and looking through his work, he writes on institutions. It is necessary to develop translocal and transnational productive and civic-based commons institutions that have sufficient power to protect human and non-human communities, the web of life, as well as long-term viability of global resources. He calls common institutions a magisteria that are neither market nor state-centric. They are cosmolocal in that they act as the global governance expressions of transnational production that have been emerging over the last 2 decades. Michel occupies an interesting role today. He is a public intellectual, and his Twitter feed is rich with macro perspectives on the world today that I think transcends left and right. He used to be a Marxist. He spent time in Osho's Rajneeshpuram in Oregon. He's been an entrepreneur. He's produced documentary films on transhumanism, and he's faced his own share of misfortune, pain, and suffering that has led him on his own journeys of transformation. 20 years ago, he created the P2P Foundation. And today, he is a sought-after thinker, especially in spaces in the crypto world, where he talks about civilization history and is highly influential in guiding many of these communities in terms of what they build, and how they create new commons and public infrastructure. I've come to know Michel living in Chiang Mai, where he also resides for the last 20 years. And Michel always comes across as very kind, very generous with his time and his energy, and carefully explaining many of the concepts that he works on. So I'm super delighted to be able to bring Michel on to the podcast and share some of his ideas with everyone. Given the length of our conversation, I decided to split the conversation into two. In part one, we're going to really focus on the civilizational history perspective, sort of bringing us to this point of transition. And in the next episode, we'll look more into how the commons might come back, what kinds of push and pull factors are important, and Michel's own journey that led him to where he is today. But for now, let's go into the first part of this conversation. And I just want to thank you wherever you are, whether you're walking your dog, eating lunch, driving a car, or sitting on a couch with your headphones, mindfully listening to this conversation. Thank you for joining. Let's go. So, Michel, I'm super delighted to have you on. Welcome to the Light Forest podcast.
Thank you, Dev. It's an Indian and a Belgian both living in Chiang Mai and talking remotely. That's the world we live in.
Absolutely, and we're going to dig into all these themes. Um, so, as is customary for the podcast, I invite you to paint a picture of a world that resonates with your vision of cosmolocalism. Um, how might people be living? What do people value? What are the institutions of this world like? Paint a picture for us of your light forest vision.
All right. Well, I find it difficult to do so without just a little bit of historical dynamic. So basically, we used to live in tribal uh, organizations. The people around you were your nephews and uncles and aunts, and you were part of a clan. And, we were in the beginning very mobile, so we could avoid, too much violent conflict with outsiders. Then we started living in villages, horticultural, and I think then we started gifting in order to maintain the peace, and if I give you a gift from family to family, clan to clan, tribe to tribe, then you want to give something back, and that socializes and pacifies the relationship. But at some point, um, and there's a lot of discussion on how that happened, but anyway, we shifted to market state civilization. So, we could say civilization is actually any society that's organized into classes that has a independent state apparatus which can repress dissent, and which has an unequal division of labor and power, and also maybe that's important, a particular way of looking at nature as something that needs to be managed, mastered, in order to obtain surpluses. And that's important because that means that markets and states are, really in essence extractive and competitive institutions that compete with each other. And, we can deplore this or not, but in any ways, this is the reality we have lived in for many thousands of years, maybe 5,000 years, maybe longer. And that means that the tribal, if it persists, it had to move to mountains and more remote areas. But basically, the core, of the continents is civilization. Um, and I believe that we have reached a very serious limit. We have planetarized civilization, um, and we've basically overexploited. So until now, civilizations would, uh, emerge, grow, reach a peak, decline, and then disappear and be replaced by others. But now we have kind of a global civilization. I'm not denying that we have differences, but think about capitalism, the nation state, corporations, they're everywhere, right? So we do have a kind of global model, even if it's kind of culturally adapted and sometimes a bit different. And I think that model is not working anymore. That it's not able. We cannot from two extractive institutions create a balance with the planet. Now, it just happens that if you look at uh, other forms of value, that we always had an alternative, which is the commons. So the commons is basically shared resources that are co-managed by a community or a set of stakeholders for the long-term, maintenance of a certain ecological resource. And until capitalist society, that was always actually part even of the civilization model. So, the if you lived in the Middle Ages in Europe, you'd have your lord, and you had to work a certain amount of hours for the lord, and you had your own little plot, but you also had common ground where the whole village could, share certain activities. And so basically, what I envisage is that we need to recalibrate, rebalance the extractive and the regenerative institutions. So I talk about the pulsation of the commons, which is, when markets and states, when civilizations work well, they provide for their core people, bread and games, welfare states, and all of that. But when they start overreaching and reaching their peak and then going down, so basically in the ascending phase of civilization, the commons would weaken, but in the descending phases of the civilization, the commons would come back, basically, right? And often religions were the vehicle that brought back the commons in society. And think about the monks, both in China, in India, in Europe. Monks have a mutualized institution. They're commons-based institutions. They have a collective property, and it's invested in the system. It's not given to private people, like dividends or anything. It's so the surplus, and especially in dark ages. In dark ages, you almost not have any market or state. The dark age is actually kind of defined by a collapse of the market and the state. Then you see the extraordinary role that commons-based institutions play in regenerating nature and human communities. So there is even, Sing Chu, a Singaporean historian. He has a trilogy. It's called World Ecological Degradation, and one volume is called Recurring Dark Ages. And he looks at pollen counts and so all kinds of physical proofs that show that dark ages are healing periods for nature and human groups. Um, and so what's the difference? And sorry, so now I come with a long detour. I come to cosmolocalism. So the thing is, until now, the local could not survive the assault of the global. So basically, big defeats small. So in small villages, we can be convivial, we can have, the council of elders and talk things out. But as soon as we scale, and some groups scaled and then overcame one from lesser organized groups, um, you couldn't do that. So you had either to flee to some marginal peripheral areas, or you had to accept a civilizational order. So here's what I believe. And of course, this is a contentious statement, but I believe we now have technologies that can scale decentralization. So we can now create translocally, we can organize very complex things like open source software, even make satellites. So there's a huge satellite project in Greece. We can do that. We can organize groups translocally, share knowledge and then start making things locally. So the cosmolocalism, I always say, to distinguish it both from globalism and from localism, I always say it's fully local and it's fully global at the same time. Fully local because we use the principle of the subsidiarity of material production. So whatever we can do local, we should do local, because two-thirds of what we spend for humanity in terms of matter energy, and the harm it does to other non-human beings is transport, not making. So if we can relocalize a lot of things, and subsidiary means not like stupidly, but smart relocalization, because some things you can do on a small scale. Um, then you can dramatically reduce the weight of humanity on the planet. Now, if you add to that mutualization, So, creating more common forms of property, communal based property forms. Then you add even more lowering of our usage of energy and matter. So I just want to give you one example. So if you create a car sharing agreement, and of course, I'm not talking about Uber here, I'm talking about associations, nonprofits, co ops. So groups of people deciding to mutualize, let's say, cars. This is done in a city like Ghent in Belgium. They had 2, 3 thousand members when I went there, and so actually people use their car 5% of the time. So if you take 10% of cars for a certain group, then you have like a double reserve, and so they do that, and every shared car replaces 9 to 13 cars, while fully preserving the freedom of point-to-point travel. And you could imagine systematizing that. So now I come to your question. So the world that I envisage is a world where people recreate conviviality through these self-organized commons-based provisioning systems, first at a local scale. But because it's not very smart to reinvent the wheel a million times, it makes sense to use the digital sphere to create protocols of cooperation, to create common software, common protocols. And so we are fully local because we are doing permaculture with our neighbors, but we are learning from all the permaculturalists in the whole world, right? And the so the requirement for this to work is, of course, and that's where it's not utopian, but it's a big problem in any way. Like, how do we get there? Then is the issue of power. Can we create trans local institutions that can be strong enough to defend themselves against the expropriation or appropriation, exploitation by large corporations or eventually states? Can we make them eventually like as strong as those other two? Or I think what is eventually needed is that we need a common centric society. So I'm not saying a communist society where we only have commons. For example, I think that territories will always need some kind of common management as a territory where people of different faiths and maybe different culture need to live together in a space and need some kind of institution to make that work. If you don't want to call it a state, it's fine with me, but some kind of like separate institution in a complex society. And I think also markets are fine. If they are aware of natural limits. And so in a way you could say that, and this is why I chose the name for civilization, but it could also be called post civilization. I'm still not entirely sure what is next. So the idea is, we had uh, hunting gathering, we had agricultural forms, we had industrial forms, we have cognitive forms of civilization. But what we need now is to shift towards an ecological civilization, right? It's to ensure that for the next millions of years, we can actually live as humanity in a long-term balance with the environment. And so I can't remember who said it, but I thought that was a nice formula. So we had an immature biosphere at the beginning on Earth. Then we had a great oxygenation event, which actually was a kind of poison, but then it created a new, kind of balanced ecosystem, right? Where it's called Gaia or Earth systems, something, So the idea is that it's a homeostatic system which preserves itself, right? So we have a mature biosphere. Paradoxically, that mature biosphere created life, human culture, human technology. And so now we have a technosphere which is endangering the biosphere. In other words, we have an immature technosphere. And how can we move from an immature technosphere to a mature technosphere? So, that's kind of my way of thinking. And, so you can imagine a lot more local organization, a lot more conviviality, local democracy, but at the same time, within a planetary consciousness. So not just identifying yourself with your local place, but fully realizing that in order to live in balance, we need also a planetary outlook. And they're not antagonistic to each other. I don't think so. I think they are. So cosmolocalism for me is like finding the right level of alignment between those two levels and eventually intermediate levels as well.
Yeah, I love the cosmolocal vision of, I think, as you put it, what's light is global and what's heavy is local, and that sort of nice
Yes.
distinction, which I think, I can see or imagine, as you described, maybe permaculture communities who are based here and are farming based on the weather conditions or the climate of their area. Yet there is this global communication and connection that's happening. It's not islands. It is still this planetary consciousness, as you talked about, but this global
Yes.
connection that's happening. And I mean, we kind of see the trends that are happening today. We have more and more of knowledge work moving light online. Yet perhaps where we're
Yes.
stuck at the moment is we still have a world where our physical, our heavy production, manufacturing, how we do trade is hyper global as well, and that's perhaps, as you say, putting a strain on our biosphere, strain on the ecology, and so that it's that heavy
Yes.
transition to the heavy that needs to move.
Yes. So, I mean, I'm not against trade. And by the way, this is just something I learned recently, but I think this is fascinating. So, as the Roman Empire collapsed in Europe, first you have like 5 centuries of chaos, and there's no more roads and no more towns, and all of that. But then when things get back, so this is so the ruling classes, the lords, they needed luxury goods, right? So this created international trade. So that was like an international market. But it's the monks who worked very hard. They ora et labora, so work and pray was the ideal of Christian monks. And so they produced daily goods. So they actually created the markets, the normal markets, and then that created the a growth period like in the 11th century. And so there is a connection. And I just want to tell you because I think this is it. No, most people don't realize this, right? So first you have military congregations that safeguarded territory. So don't forget, this was a very chaotic world, and the Vikings in the north, and the Muslims in the south, and the Avars in the east. Every 20 years there was an invasion. People got killed. Things got burned. And so first you need security, right? And I don't know if you know this, but the Cossacks, I didn't know that, were a military congregation, right? And they were the first who dominated the rivers to keep out the Mongols. And because they kept out the Mongols, Russia could emerge in this kind of secured space. So the same thing happened in Europe, where you have, the Teutonic Order, and the Templars, for example, who played these roles. Then you have the craft agrarian institutions, and so, for example, 5th century Italy had no food because the food came from Egypt, and when they lost control of Egypt, there were only slave holdings with wine and olives in Italy, but no food production, right? So it's the monks who reestablished. Basically, in 50 years, the Benedictines reestablished food production and a surplus. And this is essentially the same on a pan-European scale. Now, as I said, so they produce a surplus, they produce a market that creates crafts, and the crafts are organized as guilds, which is a mutualist organizational form, and they're the ones. creating the cities. And you have this kind of municipal autonomy. Uh, and so, I'm sorry, I don't know that much about other civilizations, but you can make parallels. For example, the Han Chinese and the Roman Empire collapsed at the same time. So probably for common climate events that destabilize both of them. And you see the same kind of religious reformations and monks and congregations emerging on a massive scale in China and India, of course, with Buddhism, right? So although I don't know that much about the other parts of the world, I think if I had time to uncover this, I think we would find very similar dynamics. And so I'm not sure we go to a dark age, but I do believe that we kind of like we have a planetary crisis, right? So it's when we speak about the meta crisis, what we mean is, so a polycrisis just means convergent crisis. Homelessness, unemployment, and we see them kind of like emerging at the same time. So multiple crises are emerging. And you can look at, for example, how homelessness is linked to unemployment. But the meta crisis is a slightly different approach. It says, what if there are common dynamics behind all of it, right? So it's more like systems thinking. Are there common, misalignments that we do in every aspect of, and that's in other words, the civilization model is that generative dynamic that misaligns our relationship with nature, right? So the meta crisis, and then you add technology to it, which accelerates everything, right? So it took a few years to make a virus in a lab in China. What if we can make 100 like that through AI? So we are entering a very high risk uh, period of civilization transition. But my hope is that if we look at the history and we see how the commons were this regenerative and healing mechanism, that we have hope that we can do that again. And actually, that's what people are doing, right? So with the P2P Foundation as an observatory, we look at how people are using these peer-to-peer translocal dynamics and creating new commons practices and institutions as a response to the global crisis. And of course, this is far away from the limelight, the Ukraine and Gaza, where, states and, the kind of the market system and the state-centric systems are kind of fighting each other. But I think underneath something is happening, which is more hopeful, because it's like creating seed forms for the future. And even though they may only, be practiced by 2 or 3% of population in the West, and probably a lot more in the global South, but they're still seen as marginal. But no, no, no. Historically, this is not a moment that they will remain marginal. This is actually experimentation to find solutions for the next type of civilization.
Are there any examples from this experimentation or ways of being or ways of organizing economics that
Well,
find interesting to you?
yeah, I so let me take the non-digital and the digital. So remind me if I forget the digital, but I want to first kind of say the non-digital. The non-digital, that's what I call urban commons, but you could say rural commons or bioregional commons. It's so I did a study in the city of Ghent, which is in the Flanders in Belgium, 250,000 people, and the mayor asked me to map the urban commons because so they used the concept citizen-centric, common-centric citizen initiatives. That was the vocabulary they used there. So he could see that more and more citizens were organizing themselves to get organic food together, to share transportation, even like child rearing because it was too expensive, so they did it as parents together. Self-organized homeschooling. So there was this whole thing happening. And he said, we want to know more about this. Who are these people? What are they doing? What do they want from us? Is there a way for the city to connect with them and maybe help them? And we found that there were 50 of these initiatives in 2008 and 500 in 2016. So that's like a tenfold growth in 10 years. Afterwards, I looked at statistics for the Flanders, for the Netherlands, for Catalonia, even from Colombia and Ecuador, and we found like this is very, very consistent. So there is actually a real move, not by majorities, but by significant minorities of people to start saying, "Oh wow, maybe we can't rely on this market state nexus as much as we think we did. So we better look at alternatives and see maybe we can do it in a different way." Right? So it's a time of experimentation. And there's just a book that came out, Asset in Common. It just came out in the US, which reviews the 5 or 6 new forms that this can take, in terms of like legal and regulatory realities. Because of course, you live in a world where there is law and police and states. So we don't do exactly 100% what we want, but we can do a lot, even within the present kind of hostile environment. Because this is something, of course, we should not be naive about. The Western system, the capitalist system, was designed to destroy the commons. It was based on enclosures of the land. And I was talking to a lady in the US, and she said, Michael, it's forbidden to dry your clothes in the sun. It's forbidden to grow vegetables in front of your house. It's forbidden to recuperate rainwater. It's forbidden to make your own marmalade. And she gave me this list on and on of these local regulations in the US, which are explicitly directed at basically making cooperation difficult so that you have to go buy stuff, as atomized and individualized consumers. So, our society is not neutral. It's hostile to the commons. But then we have to go to the digital where the thing gets a bit complicated. So I make this kind of like simplified history of the commons. But so the commons originally were, focused on mutualizing physical resources, like a pasture or, a mountain flank or a river system or something like that, right? And people make agreements with each other so that this resource can be managed in a way that it can persist for many generations. Capitalism enclosed this, right? They said, no, this is not productive. This is not a good way to get a surplus from it. So we need to get rid of it. And what they did when Europe started with this in the most radical way. I mean, it's cross cultural and cross civilization, but Europe was like the first to switch to the industrial form, in a dominant way. And so what this created the enclosures is it basically privatized the ownership because it was. So that's what people maybe usually don't understand. But feudal property was a relationship. I protect you, and in order that I can protect you, you have to work for me. 50% of the produce went to the ruling class. And of course, they got a lot more than they actually needed, but that was the kind of social contract. And that meant that property was seen as a communal thing, even for the lords. It's not their personal property, it was their duty to manage this land, and serfs were their children. And so they had these paternalistic visions of how it should be done. And now it becomes private property, dominion. This is mine and I can do with it what I want. And if I can make more money with sheep than with people, I'll chase away the people, which is what happened on a massive scale. So the second epoch, if you like, in the commons is when the proletariat, the working class, which is, atomized, deculturalized, working, 14, 15 hours a day, still, is a reality in many countries. um, they started self-organizing, right? So they created social commons, mutualities, fraternities, unions, health insurance. They all did it by themselves, within a very hostile society, certainly in the 19th century. So that's the second phase. And so note what happens. The physical commons were privatized, but the social commons were statified. right? Which in a way was a good thing because that's what they wanted, because only 25% of working class, had these commons. But once you make it a civic right, it's for 100% of the people who have welfare. But the cost, of course, is no longer self-organized, becomes a service in which you're just a consumer, right? So the commons kind of disappeared. So the third phase for me is with the digital commons, reignite the consciousness of the commons, which had been completely obliterated, certainly in Western Europe and the US. Like people don't even know what it meant. I know that this is quite different in like say the rural areas of India or Africa, but certainly in Europe, the physical commons had been obliterated. And so now suddenly you have these cognitive layers of society say, oh, well, it makes sense to share knowledge, to create wikis and write open software and open design, because then we can learn so much faster from each other. And then we can actually create little businesses around it, right? Um, but, and this is the paradox. So that capitalism, which is a very adaptive system, moved from kind of a Marxist capitalism, which is, hiring workers and getting a surplus from the workers. It became a Proudhonian capitalism, because Proudhon said the surplus comes from cooperation. You have 100 craft workers, you put them together, they'll be more productive. And so now we have all the new companies are commons exploiting companies. So Uber doesn't produce cars, Airbnb doesn't produce apartments. They let supply and demand meet on their platform, and they extract a rent from it, right? So basically, sharing, commoning is also used, um, in these faux commons, these pseudo commons that created, these new types of companies like Google and so I would claim that today we have a commons extracting capitalism, much more than a like a commodity based, which is in agreement with Varoufakis when he talks about techno feudalism. So I'm in agreement. I use a different vocabulary. I talk about netarchical capitalism, the hierarchy of the network, but it's not the whole story. So sorry if I go on. Just let me tell that the other side of the story is that we can still use it. We can still create real commons. We can still protect real commons. We can do reverse cooptation, right? And this is where crypto comes in. And I know crypto gets a very bad rap, and for many good reasons. It's there's a lot of issues, but still, historically, open source free software created the capacity for global coordination of human labor through social signaling in open ecosystems. That's like a fundamental advance for humanity because it allows global scaling of cooperation outside of market and state. I mean, they can influence it, but they cannot fully control it because we now have contributory communities. But at the core of these digital commons, because it couldn't be valorized on the market directly, we got multinationals, you know, paying a lot of people in the core and therefore exerting a huge influence on open source. And so I see crypto as a solution to that. So now we have a system which can only continues to use open source, continues to coordinate labor, but can distribute the funding and can create funding for the core development, right? And so now we have these networks, these crypto networks, that are able to self-tax themselves, right? And to create public goods. So in other words, they create their own commons, self-financed outside of the market state nexus. And so this is leading to then, and then I'll finish my little uh, tunnel, which is what I call fourth sector organizations. I think this is what we are building. So we have markets, we have governments, we have NGOs. Then we created commons based peer production. So the capacity for self organized contributory projects. Put all of that together in one new organization, which can integrate those four. And so now we have organized networks with commons, in my view, as the new organizational form for cosmolocalism, right? I'm not saying we're ready, but I'm saying we're in an advanced stage of self-infrastructuring, experimentation. We're not where we want to be, but we are certainly moving in that direction. That's my own optimistic conviction.
I wanted to come in on the point of cosmolocalism because I think it's a very interesting perspective of being both global as well as local. I think as we're sitting today, and there is this feeling that perhaps globalization has led to a lot of the degradation of the commons today, and this question of looking back, looking to ancient knowledge or looking to ancient perspectives. There's also a recognition that today we have this global identity, this shared oneness, a recognition of the entire planet, which didn't really exist in the past. So, as we sit today and we talk about wanting to reorganize, we both want to maintain this sense of a global consciousness, a oneness, a shared global identity, while also being deeply grounded and embedded in our local communities, being aware of the kinds of fruits and vegetables that grow around, being aware about the communities that live around us, having a lot of touch points and relationships and connections with life around us, because I think that grounds us, and that's something that many of us, especially digital workers, as we see our collaborations and as we see information now so globally connected, we sometimes almost lose a perception of the importance of this groundedness, of this local rootedness. So I think cosmolocalism really stands out here as an interesting framework for us that takes us into this shared global identity and localness. I think Michel's critique on the digital commons and how it's been also taken over, co opted by the state and market forces is, I think, very apt. Several scholars, Tim Wu has talked in the past about how market and state forces have always co opted media that starts out decentralized to eventually becoming more centralized. Other scholars, such as Zuboff and surveillance capitalism, brings essentially the awareness that the surveillance business models of big tech are largely down to the capitalist logic. Um, and similarly, several other scholars have all brought attention to the systemic nature of why our web spaces, why our digital spaces has been degraded, has been co opted. Right, so we can get back to our conversation with Michel, where he goes into his view of the state of the international system today, particularly into this concept of the meta crisis and the battle between market and state forces, and how that might finally lead to the emergence of a third space, the common space.
That's what Daniel Schmachtenberg and I work with the group of people around him. That's what does he call it again? The third attractor, right? So we have in in a civilization transition, you get fragmentation. Fragmentation leads to polarization, and then the choice is chaos or suppression. So either you get, like tyranny to keep the lid on this disorder, or chaos. But there is a third attractor. This is a new way to organize it that allows a higher level of complexity, a higher level of integration, and keeping the achievements of the previous period, right? So when the Roman Empire collapses, it's because there's no more energy and gold, and so they basically collapse. So what comes after is a lower level of complexity. But after the Reformation and the religious civil wars in Europe, the capital state nation system, whatever we might critique it, had a higher level of complexity because it could keep religious freedom, which it pushed to the sides, and it found a new way to integrate the world. And, of course, it destroyed nature and did a lot of things, but at the same time, it has existed for centuries, and, health, longevity. I mean, there's a lot of things that it achieved despite the cost of it, right? Now, of course, it's much more difficult. We have to do it at world scale, and I don't claim I have all the answers, but the thing is, like, let's look what people are doing, right? Let's look at the people in Exodus and what they are inventing and what works, what doesn't work. So over time, we can see this, and then they can combine and learn from each other, form subsystems and create like a layer that's strong enough at some point. And so okay, let me also introduce the idea of jurisdictional alliances. So here's the contradiction: slaves never win. Either they are killed, like Spartacus, and if they win, they create a new elite, like the Mamluks or the Bolsheviks. Now but also you cannot rule without legitimacy and some kind of agreement from the people, right? And so the way that works is through jurisdictional alliances, some kind of like set of values which creates agreement at the bottom, the middle, and the top. And then for example, the top becomes corrupt, weakens the whole society. Like the Germanic invaders come in, they can't run the society, so they make a deal with the Christians, right? And that creates a new jurisdictional alliance that becomes the basis of a new type of society. So I'm not saying the communists will win on their own. I don't think so. But I think at some point, some so you can see it's already happening, right? So Lenin used to say revolutions happen when the ruling class is split, right? So now we have this. We have two factions of the ruling class: the globalists, who want to sacrifice the nation to the empire, and the localists, Trump and Modi and all of that, who want to restore the nation, right? Eventually at the cost of empire. So the state centric and the market centric are in a global cultural war. But both are representing extractive institutions that compete with each other. So none of them has a planetary solution. The solution of the WEF, which is kind of like the representative of the market-centric ideology, is global stakeholder coalitions, but without the people, right? NGOs, yes, but not the people. And then the Russian-Chinese axis is let's put the state back in charge. I think there will be like a third option, which is some alignment around the idea. No, we need the commons, and the big question is religiously, right? How does that happen religiously? What is the equivalent today
What's the
of
consciousness
the unity
evolution?
that was
Yeah.
created? Yeah, what is the unity that was created by Buddhism, Catholic Christianity, Eastern Orthodoxy, Islam? So it wasn't planetary, but it was big. It was continental, right? Continental unity. And to be honest, I'm not sure about that one.
So that was the first part of our conversation with Michel Bauwens. Join us for the next episode next week, where we'll go into the dynamics of how the commons will come back, as well as hear from Michel on his personal journey. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and please, if you haven't already, do subscribe to the podcast. Feel free to leave a rating or a comment. It helps immensely with the distribution. And with that, have a wonderful week ahead, and I will join you next week. Bye bye.